East Belfast in the 1980s was quite a place to grow up. It was a time of bombings, balaclavas, and British Army checkpoints. But that was all just the violent backdrop of an upbringing that was remarkably similar to that of any other kid my age. I wanted the same things that teenagers everywhere wanted: drink, girls, nights out, all the sinful adult entertainment that was only barely out of my reach, both figuratively and literally when it came to certain top-shelf magazines. Obviously, lots of lads my age were getting into sectarian stuff, following fathers or brothers into the IRA or the UVF or whatever other three-letter acronym thugs were terrorizing our communities all across Northern Ireland during that time. But I can't remember ever giving a monkey's bottom about prods or tags or Fenians or Huns. If you were all right with me, I was all right with you. And I gave even less of a toss once I realized that the only thing sectarianism had to offer were prison or premature death. Back then, I didn't care about Irish freedom. All I wanted was the freedom to stay out past 11:30 acting like a buck idiot without my da tanning my hide. But whether or not you subscribed to such ideas was irrelevant. Even if it wasn't your business, the small but vocal militant minority made it your business. You just didn't have a say in the matter. The troubles meant there was no shortage of angsty young men around to write loud, shouty songs about rampant injustices, and I'd like to think that's why Belfast produced a disproportionately high amount of great punk bands. The Outcast, Stalag 17, The Defects. Me and my mates would go to as many of their gigs as we could, and that whole scene meant drink, drugs, and liberal young ladies. Now, most of my pals were into the drink, but me and this lad Stacky liked to smoke too, and it wasn't easy to get your hands on it in Belfast at the time, for a number of reasons. But two people shorten the road, as they say. So, one day, me and Stacky are trying to get hold of some smoke when we hear from a mate of ours that this St. Lucian bloke he knew was selling a load of Moroccan hash he'd smuggled in on a boat. We were up to high dough hearing this. Only problem was that his flat was over in West Belfast. For those who are out of the loop, I'll try to keep this simple. I was from East Belfast, the mostly Protestant side, and this bloke's flat was in West Belfast, the mostly Catholic side of the city. Under most circumstances, it would not be good form for a young Protestant lad like me to go wandering round the West End, but we were desperate for a joint, so we hatched what we thought would be a genius plan to cheat the system. Only way we were going to be able to get across the city was by taxi, but we'd be hard pushed to get a taxi company from either area to drive into enemy territory and back again. So we habandandered down towards Botanic, which was still quite a mixed area at the time, then called a taxi company near Glen Road, saying we needed to get to Ardine and back. Taxi driver thinks we're Catholic, gives us a lift, we get our smoke, and there's no drama. I'm 17 at the time, less than a year out of school and still looking for work. Wednesdays consisted of me begging for a few quid off my ma for lunch on my job search, then spending the day in a pub that we could get served at because one of the lads was second cousins with the barman. Those were good days they were, getting banjaxed and then stumbling back to one of our parents' houses to listen to records until they kicked us out. Great stuff. Point being, I was a regular in this one pub in Ravenhill. People knew my face there. I used to think that was a good thing. Turns out that there was a bad side to it too. Because one day, these blokes walk into the pub, and immediately we know something is dodgy because they walk straight past the bar and into the center of the room. They're scanning all the tables, which are backed up against the walls, looking for someone. And it turned out that someone was me and Stacky. They walk up to us, lean over the table, and then in these hushed voices, they put the fear of God into me, say 5 little words that made me want to throw up. Jimmy McNamara wants to see you. I've changed some names here to protect the innocent, but let's just say the bloke I've named Jimmy was a feared senior member of the Ulster Defense Association, probably the biggest Protestant paramilitary organization operating at that time. They called him Mad Dog. I'm not even joking, and it was a nickname he'd done more than enough to earn, given that he had a reputation as being one of the most brutally violent psychopaths ever to have graced the streets of Belfast. The thing you've got to remember is that most of these paramilitary groups weren't shy about hurting the same people they claimed to be protecting, and happened on both sides. The IRA kidnapped, tortured, and killed a Catholic mother of 8 because they thought she was passing information to the British Army. And the Schenkel butchers ended up killing 2 of their brother Protestants because they mistook them for Catholics. You see now why I thought the whole thing was a load of bollocks. The point is, if Jimmy McNamara was really all about defending good Protestants from evil, bloodthirsty Catholics who had to stuff their devil tails down the back of their trousers, I shouldn't have been soiling myself about having to meet him, which I most definitely was. Me and Stacky were given an address to go to right away, one that was only about 20 minutes walk from the pub. There was no point trying to run or hide. The UDA had people everywhere, and the kind of fear they spread among the communities meant you couldn't really blame anyone for giving you up. The kind of punishments they doled out were horrific, and I was always terrified of getting kneecapped. For those fortunate enough not to know what that is, sorry, maybe skip this next part if you're a wee bit squeamish. Kneecapping is where a bloke shoots you in the back of the knee to basically blow your kneecap out. The damage can tend to vary depending on the kind of gun and the kind of bullet, but best case scenario, you're going to have a horrifically painful injury that takes a good long while to recover from. But worst case scenario, you get severe nerve damage and walk with a limp for the rest of your life, have to have your leg amputated, or you bleed to death because everyone's too scared to call you an ambulance. And if you really annoyed the paramilitaries, they'd shoot you in the ankles and elbows too. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you how claustrophobic that can be for any future Olympic gymnasts out there. Those kind of punishment shootings were sickeningly common when I was a lad, so as you can imagine, I was scared out of my wits. It was a good thing me and Stacky had a pint or 2 down us, otherwise I don't think we'd ever have had the courage to face our fate like men. After we had the address and the blokes walked off, we just necked our pints, walked out of the pub, and started walking off in the direction of what we assumed was going to be a UDA safe house. A lot of neighborhoods had places like that, abandoned houses that a group used as a weapons cache or a place to hide out from the cops. Sometimes the house didn't even need to be abandoned. Blokes with guns marched into your gaff and told you what was what. You didn't dare say a word on the contrary. And so, after a walk that felt like it went on forever, we finally get to the house and knock on the door. At first, the bloke who answers doesn't seem to know why we're there, and we were made to sit on the wooden floor of a room that looked like it was in the process of being redecorated. After a while, 2 blokes start coming down the stairs, and when they walk in the room, I see one of them is Jimmy McNamara. "You 2, upstairs, now," he says to us, and we didn't dare disobey. Once we reach the top of the stairs, Jimmy and his mate separate me and Stacky into different bedrooms, which, again, are totally bare rooms where the windows are covered up with newspaper. "Sit," Jimmy says. Then he and his pal leave me alone for a moment, before both reappear to tie my wrists behind my back and my ankles to the chair. I was shaking so badly when the other fellow was tying my hands, he started talking to me like he was an uncle or something. "Here, lad. It's not that bad. Calm down. Jimmy just wants to talk. Be honest and you'll be fine. There's a good lad." That kind of weird fatherly tone knocks me sick even today, knowing what they were planning and what kind of people they were. I mean, they really were psychopaths to think that they could go around acting like that and still be the good guys. After that, I'm left alone again, alone in this barely lit, absolutely boggin' room, with nothing to keep me company but the stink of my own sweat and fear. After a while, Jimmy walks back into the room alone and shuts the door behind him. He stares at me for a solid minute or so, just in complete silence. There was no soul behind his eyes at all. They were just dead. He looked like a man who never slept. "Do you know who I am?" he asks me. I just nod. "Good," he says. "And that saves us some time. Here's the crack. I'm going to ask you some questions now, and you're going to answer them honestly. Is that clear?" I nod again. "What were you doing the other day? in a Fenian taxi going over to Airdine there? He asks. I'm completely and utterly trapped by the question. The one thing that united all the different paramilitary groups was their disdain for drug dealers and drug users. If I admit that I was looking to buy drugs, I'll be shot, no questions asked. But if I lie and tell him something else, he might think I'm a Republican or that I'm at least working with them. I was scared out of my mind, in no fit state to make a rational decision, so I lied. I told him I was looking at buying a guitar from a wee shop there, that I knew I shouldn't have been spending money in Catholic shops. I was really sorry and I'd never do it again. Blah, blah, blah. All lies. Jimmy was a violent, psychopathic thug, but he was good at his job, and he knew a lie when he heard one. He just sighed and shook his head, walked over to the wall and banged on it 3 times. Immediately after he does so, I just hear someone screaming bloody murder from the next room, like a horrible blood-curdling scream for a moment, and then silence. Then another scream, silence, and repeat ad nauseum. You hear that? Jimmy says to me, pacing around the room like a disappointed head teacher. That's your pal in there taking electric shocks. He lied too. Now listen to him. Stacky let out a particularly pained cry of pure agony, and Jimmy actually smiled when he heard it. So unless you want your bollocks rigged up to a rover battery, I suggest you stop telling fibs. And at that I told him everything. I told him about the smoke, the taxi company, the bloke selling, everything. It all just came out in this big stream of consciousness. When I was done, Jimmy banged on the wall again and the screaming stopped. See? He said. Wasn't so hard, was it? Good lad. Let's go see your friend. Jimmy then walked out of the room and I'm left alone again. At this point, I know I'm up the creek, and what's worse, I've basically grassed Stacky up too. He who keeps his tongue keeps his friends, and all that. I like to think of myself as a bit of a hard case, hanging around pubs or banging heads at gigs, but as I'm tied to that chair, waiting on some horrendous corporal punishments that I'm unlikely to ever fully recover from, I just start crying like a wee baby. Then, out of nowhere, I'm completely silenced by a gunshot coming from the other room. Stacky screams out in agony and falls quiet again. And for the first time since I was a child, I actually just peed myself right there and then. Jimmy and his pal come back into the room announcing that Stacky has had his punishment. And then once I've had mine, we'll have to hop down the street to a pub that Jimmy will call an ambulance to. The way he used that word hop, just so casually, it was horrific how relaxed he was while talking about kneecapping, about maiming another human being for life. I'm just too scared to do anything but cooperate as they start to untie me. Fight back and make a run for it, and I'm dead man for certain. Do as I'm told, and I'll be shot in the back of the knee. And again, they start using that sickening fatherly tone one of them used before, telling me the punishment is for my own good, how smoking hash is bad for me, and how they'll be helping me out in the long run. Be a good lad, keep still. It'll all be over before you know it, one of them said as they held me down on the floor. I felt the barrel of the gun on the back of my leg, and I burst into tears. It was an actual nightmare that I couldn't wake up from, and these blokes acting like they were trying to take care of me was making it all more disturbing. All right, son, brace yourself, Jimmy said before starting the countdown of 3, 2, 1. By the time he got to 1, I was just screaming, like gritting my teeth and letting out this growl to try and counteract the fear and approaching agony. Then, click. Nothing. Jimmy pulls the trigger and nothing happens. No pain, no blood, nothing. Stand up, Jimmy says, and I do as I'm told. Look me in the eye when I'm talking to you. I try, but I can't, so he carries on anyway. Consider this a fair warning, he says and holds up the pistol. Next time, this will be loaded. Now get out. Next thing, me and Stacky are walking back to the pub in a state of pure shock, just like they tricked me with the fake punishment routine. they tricked him too. Only they really had used electric shocks on him after he'd lied the first time. Even show me the wee burns on his ankle where the bloke had touched the wires. I think that was the first time I really questioned whether or not I had a future in Northern Ireland. If I really wanted my life to be defined by thugs and soldiers, bullets and bombs. It didn't take me long to work out that I didn't. I run a pub in England now, some corporate place with plastic Irish sensibilities, but it puts food on my family's table and I'm happy here. I thought I might move the family back home once things died down, but there are just too many bad memories for me now, things I'd rather leave behind. That and the fact that the bloke who subjected me to one of the most traumatic things in my entire life is just free to walk the streets. Lots of people escaped justice as part of various ceasefire agreements that brought peace to the 6 counties, and Jimmy McNamara was one of them. I don't mean to gurn, but I just couldn't live in a place where blokes like that have just gotten away with the crimes they committed. People who have so much blood on their hands that the used pint glasses have to be washed twice. I get that many people do, that people have chosen to just live with the legacy of the Troubles. But me, I just couldn't do it. Too much blood, too many ghosts, too many monsters that don't have to hide in the dark anymore. Back in the late 70s, I used to drive freight all over Ireland, in the North and in the Republic. I managed to collect a number of good stories after driving around the country for the better part of 10 years. Some good, some bad. But this one is by far the most hair-raising for me. So one day I was driving from Derry to Belfast across the Glenshin Road at about lunchtime. Back in those days, it was a particularly quiet stretch of road, and you're about to find out why. But nevertheless, my job required me to be driving down it, so there I was. I hadn't seen another car for about an hour. The countryside is very open and barren out there, and there hadn't been a building since miles back. Then suddenly, I can see these 2 little specks on the road in front of me in the distance. I realize it's 2 vehicles moving toward me side by side, only that meant one vehicle's driving on the wrong side of the road. So I'm thinking, I don't like this, and I slow down just a tad to err on the side of caution. Lo and behold, it's 2 Saracens, a kind of British armored car that they had back in those days, and they're speeding toward me on this long stretch of deserted road. I'm already worried by that point. The aggressive driving, the speed they're coming at me, absolutely 0 witnesses around. Everything about the situation is giving me the jitters in a big way. I get about a quarter of a mile closer to them when both armored cars suddenly veer off to the edge of the road. Their bellies open, and with rifles in hand, about a dozen soldiers come pouring out of each, forming a line on each side of the road, before pointing their weapons in my direction. I'm slow to about 20 by that point, sweaty palms gripping the steering wheel, feeling all the blood drain out of my face as my heart starts going a mile a minute. I hear one of the soldiers shout so loud that I can well hear him over my truck's engine, and I'm just thinking, this is it. Time for the big sleep. But no one shoots. There's just these horrible few moments of me slowly rolling my wagon towards them, expecting them to open fire or at least stop my vehicle for a search. See, the firm I worked for was based down in Wexford, so the wagon had a Republic of Ireland number plate on it. Enough to attract some mild suspicion, I suppose, but I'd never been presented with my own firing squad before. I'm absolutely bricking it, getting closer and closer to the British soldiers, all lined up with the rifles pointed. Only as I get closer, I realize they're not really pointing their guns at me. They're pointing them down the road behind me. In fact, as I slowed to a crawl, I saw they weren't paying any attention to me whatsoever. It was like I was invisible. It was honestly quite surreal. I had to make some nervous eye contact with their sergeant or officer or whatever he was and give him a nod to see if I was allowed to pass. He just waved me through like it was the most normal thing in the world. I don't think I exhaled until I got to Belfast, 20 minutes later. I remember just parking my wagon up in the depot and just sitting there for a minute or 2, staring into space before I got out. I was really shaken up by it, being relatively new on the job, but when I told my boss about it, he just shrugs his shoulders and tells me to crack on. Apparently stuff like that happened to loads of fellas, and I was lucky not to get stopped and searched. Another bloke told me that a gang of power-hungry little corporals held him up for half an hour one night, had him kneeling in the rain while they ransacked the contents of his wagon. Only good thing about the Irish number plates was that RA, that's the Irish Republican Army to all ye uninitiated, gave me no bother. In all fairness, I should mention that most of the times I had to deal with the Brits, they treated me relatively fairly. You didn't make a problem for them, and they didn't make a problem for you. You had to be really unlucky to get that one bugger who had himself a bad day and wanted to take it out on you. I reckon the soldiers on the road that day were taking part in some kind of training or exercise, or maybe the people they were looking for were coming up the road behind me. But regardless, it didn't happen again. And thank Jesus, too, because I'm not quite sure my heart could have withstood another run-in like that. It's a different kind of fear, you know, when you really think you're about to cop it, and I hope I never have to feel it ever again. Because as they say here in Ireland, may the good Lord take a liking to you. But not too soon. When my Nana was very young, she was fortunate enough to have been able to meet her great-grandmother. The women in our typically Irish family tend to have their children at a young age, so it's not unusual for one of the older members of our clan to be able to meet their great-grandchildren before they shuffle off their mortal coil. Now, her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, always wore black. She was a scathing but witty old dear, and if she didn't like you, she would say things like, "May the cat eat you and the devil eat the cat." She was also a widow, lost her husband early on in their marriage, and stuck to her vow of perpetual mourning. The experience made her a deeply religious woman, too. I mean, every Irish person has a little of the church in them anyway, but she took her faith very, very seriously after losing her husband, and I think a lot of that is down to the circumstances in which she lost him. You see, my great-great-grandfather was a sailor in the Royal Navy, which wasn't unheard of back then since we were still subjects of the British Empire, and the ship he sailed on was named the HMS Wasp. Early one morning in the year of 1884, the crew of the HMS Wasp were given the task of ferrying a gang of bailiffs and police to this place called Inistrahall, a little island off the coast of Donegal. The police had nasty business to attend to, as on the island, 3 poor families were no longer able to pay rent to the landowner and were due to be kicked out of their houses. When the sailors found out that they were abetting such cruelty, their hearts sank. The HMS Wasp has visited them previously, delivering a few sacks of potatoes when the islands were on the verge of starvation. They knew how hard life was for the poor islanders, who somehow eked out an existence on a rock that's less than half a square mile in size. The way my Nana tells it, it was so early in the morning that the sun hadn't yet risen, but the crew of the Wasp had sailed those waters many times before, and the veil of darkness was no hindrance to them. Yet somehow, the ship managed to collide with some rocks just off of a place called Tory Island. The ship went down fast, with only 6 of the boat's passengers and crew surviving the freezing cold waters. 52 sailors, policemen, and bailiffs drowned that morning, with my great-great-grandfather being one of them. The incident was a huge scandal, and mainly because it emerged that the HMS Wasp had sunk directly within sight of a lighthouse. This meant that, by all accounts, they should have been well aware of their positioning in relation to rocks they knew well were there. So, as you can imagine, a great deal of rumor and mystery shrouded the ship's sinking, and one particular explanation seemed to capture the imaginations of the mainlanders. It was said that the folk who lived on Inistrahall Island had long been isolated from the Irish mainland and viewed mainlanders with contempt and suspicion. Hundreds of years before, Christianity had been slow to make its way over to Inistrahall, and legend speaks of a massacre that occurred there after many of the islanders refused to renounce their old gods. People said that there was still some who lived on the island that worshipped pagan deities, invoking ancient curses and performing blood sacrifices. So, when a ghastly theory emerged that the islanders had used a kind of cursing stone known as a cloc terre to sink the wasp before it could land bailiffs on the island. People actually believed it. What's worse is that the story then tells of a local priest who heard of such ungodly practices and sailed to Inistrahal. There he located the cloc terre and promptly hurled it into the ocean to cleanse the taint of paganism from the island. The same priest then safely made it back to the mainland where, by some horrible twist of fate, slipped and fell on a walkway one day and drowned in the River Finn. People were absolutely convinced it was the curse of the cloc terre, and my great-great-grandmother was one of them. Until the day she died, she believed something unholy had risen up from the ocean to take her husband away from her. Now obviously, I know that's just a silly old story my family tells, despite all my aunties swearing it's the God-honest truth. And I know because I actually did some research into the sinking of the HMS Wasp, but that didn't make what I found any less horrifying. The Royal Navy held an inquiry into the incident and were looking to court-martial the surviving sailors for negligence. Only one of the survivors had been on deck at the time of collision, and this man swore that the lights of the Tory lighthouse went dark not long before they hit the rocks. Since it was a routine journey for the crew, a junior officer was placed at the helm to gain some experience, but was so lacking in that department that he was unable to navigate in the dark, hence the ship hitting those rocks. To me, the idea of the lighthouse going dark is much more feasible than any cursing stone or what have you. But that means that the people of Tory Island colluded with the people of Inistrahal to plunge the ship carrying their tormentors into darkness. The islanders killed 52 men that morning, all to avoid being evicted from their homes. Whether or not you can blame them is another question entirely, and given that I actually lost a relative in the incident, I don't think I can give you an unbiased answer. But the fact remains that 52 people found themselves plunging into the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean on a freezing winter's morning in complete darkness. Imagine the horror of slowly hearing the cries of your shipmates gradually falling silent until you yourself are taken by hypothermia. You certainly don't need a belief in the supernatural for that tale to give you the shivers. In January of 1801, representatives from the parliaments of both Britain and Ireland signed what were called the Acts of Union. They were documents that officially recognized the union of two nations into what would be known as the United Kingdom. But in the 40 or so years that followed the union, successive British prime ministers struggled with the conundrum of governing a country with an appallingly low standard of living. Ireland's farms were few in number, poorly run, and extremely inefficient. Couple that with a population swollen by a booming birth rate, and you have a recipe for disaster. So throughout the early 19th century, the British government launched a huge agrarian effort to introduce the humble potato as the sustainer of the great unwashed. The now well-loved vegetable was poorly received at first, as at the time, the diet of Irish peasants was still based on butter, milk, and grain products. But after pressure from landowners and royalty who needed a low-cost food source to fuel their workers and boost their profits, popularity slowly began to rise. By the end of the 1820s, the potato had proved its worth by being a reliable source of food throughout the long and frigid winters. And the particular variety of potato that was used, the Irish lumper, grew consistently large in a relatively short period of time. Yet the farming methods of the day were nowhere near as sophisticated as they are now, and by the middle of the 19th century, almost all of Ireland's abundant potato crop was based around a single, specific genetic variety. The benefits were evident. The Irish were far less likely to rebel with full stomachs, and the nation's productivity soared. But the lack of genetic variety in the potato crop would prove a fatal weakness to Ireland's newfound prosperity, with grave consequences for its population. Towards the end of 1844, newspapers all throughout the British Isles began to receive reports of a strange disease that had been ravaging crops over in the United States. Potato crops from all over the eastern seaboard had been affected by a blight so virulent and destructive that in some cases, Not a single edible potato could be harvested from a farmer's field. The blight was said to turn potatoes as black as coal and cause them to give off a stench so vile that it would turn the stomachs of all who encountered it. British optimism, conflicting reports, and general misinformation stifled what might have been an organized, effective response. British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel wrote a letter to a colleague in 1845 saying that he found the reports to be deeply alarming, but also reminded him that there was, in his words, always a tendency to exaggeration in Irish news. But by mid-August 1845, this devastating new variety of potato blight had reached the shores of northern and central Europe, and only when the crop was harvested in October did the scale of destruction become apparent. Reports from the continent came pouring in, horror stories of how the potato harvest had been catastrophically low. What's worse, no one had the slightest idea what this new kind of blight was and actually referred to it as potato cholera during the early days of the outbreak. One farmer reported that a strange mist came over the Irish Sea, and the potato stalks turned black as soot. The fields were a wide waste of putrefaction, giving off an offensive odor that could be smelled for miles. During the harvest of 1845, farmers found that around 1/3 of their entire potato crop had been consumed by the blight. A devastating loss by any means, but one that paled in comparison with the losses of the following year. As in 1846, the situation was worse than anyone could have possibly imagined. More than 75% of all Irish potatoes were rendered completely inedible. By December of 1846, more than 350,000 Irish peasants were completely unable to feed themselves. And as the number of people unable to obtain food rose, news began to trickle in of the first deaths from starvation. However, the greatest number of deaths were not directly from nutritional deficiency diseases, but from diseases brought on by malnutrition, as starving people were extremely vulnerable to viral and bacterial infection. The immune system is devastated by the effects of starvation, increasing the likelihood of death to diseases like measles, diphtheria, diarrhea, tuberculosis, whooping cough, intestinal parasites, and cholera. What's more, as starving people descended on soup kitchens, food depots, and overcrowded workhouses, they inadvertently created conditions that were ideal for spreading infectious diseases such as typhus, typhoid, and relapsing fever. In essence, the variety of terrible conditions each acted as their own ingredient that, when added to the already simmering political situation, created a cauldron of suffering and death that wrought havoc on the Emerald Isle. Survivors' accounts of the period are truly harrowing. Due to the lack of scientific understanding, those who lived through the famine essentially had no idea what brought the blight to Ireland. It's most likely that trade ships returning from the U.S. were the source of the spread, but to those living in 19th century Ireland, it was believed the blight was caused by some hideous, cursed fog that rolled in from the ocean. Even respected and trusted members of the clergy propagated this idea, which must have absolutely terrified the local populace. The 1846 testimony of Reverend Robert McGowan stated that, "I was descending the mountain when I saw a thick white fog gradually creeping up the sides of the hills. When I entered it, I was pained with a cold. I had once feared some great disaster. The next morning I found the whole potato crop everywhere blighted. The leaves were blackened and hanging loosely on their stems, and a disagreeable odor filled the air." And at a time when religion played a central role in the lives of almost everyone, members of the church must have struck terror into the hearts of the Irish peasantry by making claims like, "Surely God is angry with this land. The potatoes would not have rotted unless He sent the rot into them. God is good, and because He is, He never sends a scourge upon His creatures unless they deserve it. But He is so good that He often punishes people in mercy. When He sees them going in a bad way, He chastises them." The suffering through such atrocious events is one thing, but to have pillars of your community tell you that you basically deserve it, that must have had a calamitous effect on the national psyche. The Illustrated London News commissioned Irish artist James Mahoney to create a series of sketches depicting the horror and scale of the disaster and report on his findings as he toured the country. Today, his horrific account remains one of the most powerful and visceral records of the famine. While he describes many extreme incidents, his visit to the town of Clonakilty was typical of what he found in Irish towns. In 1847 he wrote, "We came to Clonakilty where the coach stopped for breakfast, and here for the first time the horrors of the poverty became visible, and the vast number of famished poor who flocked around the coach to beg alms. Amongst them was a woman carrying in her arms the cadaver of a fine child and making the most distressing appeal to the passengers for aid to enable her to purchase a coffin and bury her dear little baby." The Marquis of Waterford was haunted by some of the things he saw, and wrote in 1846 that the faces of these people were subdued with hunger, pale or rather of a ghostly yellow, indicative of utmost destitution. "They are starving." We hurried with horror from these frightful visitations which are permitted by Providence for his own wise ends, feeling sick at heart. Their demonic yells are still ringing in my ears, and their horrible images are fixed on my brain. A group of English Quakers sent a charitable mission to Ireland, hoping to alleviate the suffering of the starving. What they saw shook them to the core, and in 1846, a Quaker man named William Foster described the horror he felt after coming across a group of starving children. "They were like skeletons," he wrote. "Their features sharpened with hunger and their limbs wasted, so that there was little left but bones, their hands and arms in particular being much emaciated, and the happy expression of infancy gone from their faces, leaving the anxious look of premature old age." A reporter for the Telegraph newspaper visited Castlebar in County Mayo in 1847 and observed that the people there had been driven to a brutal kind of apathy by the constant and crushing misery. "A few days ago I entered a miserable cabin, dug out of the bog. A poor woman sat, propped up against the wall inside. The stench was intolerable, and on my complaining of it, the mother pointed to a sort of square bed in one corner. It contained the putrid, the absolutely melted away remains of her eldest son. On inquiry why she did not bury it, she assigned 2 reasons. First, she had not the strength to go out and acquaint the neighbors. Next, she waited till her other child would die, and they might bury both together." In some areas, people were so desperate for food that they resorted to feeding on seaweed, grass, or even rotten potatoes, which further exacerbated their wretched condition. And in some grisly cases, the starving were driven so mad with hunger that they even ate each other. Professor Cormac O'Grada of University College Dublin discovered one documented report which involved a man named John Connolly, who came before a court on theft charges in one of Ireland's westernmost counties. In the course of the prosecution, it emerged that the family was in such desperate straits that his wife had eaten some of the flesh off the leg of the dead body of her son. The son's body was exhumed, and it was discovered that his flesh was indeed missing. Connolly was immediately discharged, as the desperate condition of the Irish famine victims was taken into account. Another case of cannibalism was reported in the Times on May 23, 1849. In County Mayo, a starving man was reported to have extracted the heart and liver of a shipwrecked human body cast on shore, before roasting them over an open fire and wolfing down the meat. The mass immigration to the United States that was sparked off by the Great Famine gave rise to another chilling phenomenon, that of so-called coffin ships. Thousands of desperate Irish people poured onto ships which promised to take them to the land of opportunity, a place they would never be hungry again. But in doing so, with hundreds of poorly fed, disease-carrying migrants concentrated together in small, cramped living quarters, they created a hellish island of infection and destitution. And throughout no fault of their own either, as the owners of such transport ships charged extortionate prices while packing their vessels with as many would-be migrants as was physically possible. The owners then provided measly food rations and very little in the way of sanitation, and as a result, thousands died in transit. Some coffin ships had a mortality rate of up to 50%, meaning that in many cases, the vessels that arrived in American and Canadian ports were little more than floating cemeteries that contained little but misery, disease, and death. It was said that sharks could be seen following the ships because so many bodies were thrown overboard. All in all, We don't actually know how many people died as a result of the Great Irish Famine. Death by malnourishment might well have been overshadowed by the deaths that came from the accompanying diseases. State registration of deaths had yet to begin in Ireland, and records kept by the Catholic Church were unreliable. A census taken in 1841 recorded a population of just over 8 million. A census immediately after the famine in 1851 counted 6.5 million, a drop of 1.5 million in 10 years. So, by all accounts, the Great Irish Famine killed an estimated 1 million Irish people over the course of a decade, with another 500,000 emigrating to the US or the UK to escape a slow, painful death by starvation. The Great Potato Famine has proven to be one of the most horrifying, haunting events that Ireland has ever experienced, an event which turned a lush green island into a hellscape of disease, hunger, and death, a place where ghost stories abound, and where the scale of the suffering might never be fully understood. I grew up on a farm just outside of Limerick in Ireland, which, as you can imagine, made for quite an uneventful upbringing. It also meant my back garden was bloody massive, so I had plenty of space to run around outside, playing make-believe with my two sisters. And without a shadow of a doubt, our favorite toy was the little Wendy house that Dad had built for us at the end of the garden. I don't know if they have those in the rest of the world, but basically a Wendy house is like a little miniature playhouse for kids. And I say little, but Dad had built us a massive one, with like a little hallway and a kitchen and a little ladder going upstairs to a little loft. It was absolutely adorable. Me and my sisters just loved it. So much so that one summer's night, when it was warm enough, we asked Mum and Dad if we could sleep out in the Wendy house one night. They were understandably reluctant to give us permission at first, but we pestered them until they finally relented. We could have a sleepover in the Wendy house, but we had to be on our best behavior, not fight, and promise not to go walking around in the dark. It was a deal. You can understand our parents' reservations too, because the end of the garden, I mentioned, was probably about 100 meters away from the actual house, near this old shuck that backed out into some woodland. Not the ideal place to leave your kids alone overnight. So that's how 3 girls under 10 years old ended up in a dimly lit wooden playhouse in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. And for some reason, my older sister Kathleen decides it would be a good idea to tell ghost stories. Kathleen has always been a bit strange. She always had a fascination with ghosts and ghoulies and witches and whatnot, ever since she was young. And since she got in her hands on a book of Irish ghost stories, she thought she might regurgitate one of the stories she's read to us. She started telling us about a ghost that actually originated in Ireland, that unlike a Dracula or a Frankenstein, which come from other countries, as 9-year-old her put it, we actually had banshees in Ireland, since that's where they originated from. Our minds are absolutely blown. Ghosts lived in graveyards, old houses, and other haunted places. You had to go to the haunted place to see one. But here's Kathleen telling us about a ghost that actually comes to you, to tell you that something's going to die in your family. And the way it lets you know it is by screaming in the middle of the night, like a ghostly, ear-piercing wail. Kathleen goes on to tell us that these banshees are women who have died in terrible, painful ways, hence the screaming, and that they look like shriveled old women with red eyes who carry bowls of blood. We were just about trembling in our pajamas by the time Kathleen finished describing the nightmarish appearance of the banshee by torchlight. But somehow, when Dad came out to interrupt and tell us it was bedtime, we managed to get comfy and drift off to an uneasy sleep. The next thing I know, I'm wide awake in total darkness and everything is deathly quiet. Then I hear something that was so frightening that at first, I think I just froze up in complete terror. It was a shrill, ear-piercing shriek, almost gravelly too, as if it had come from the throat of an old lady. When I finally found the courage to move, I shot up from my makeshift bed, shaking my sisters awake and telling them to listen. We just sat there in the darkness for a moment, all 3 of us terrified, until we heard the screech again. Hearing it for a second time had me just about out of my mind with fear, But my little sister took it even worse. "It's a banshee," I remember her crying. "We have to tell Mom and Dad." Then my big sister, God bless her, decides that even though she's terrified, she's gonna run to Mom and Dad so they can rescue us from the banshee. Say what you like about Kathleen, but she believed in her own hype. She thought there was a banshee out there just as much as us. I mean, what else could have been making those ungodly noises out there? We're frantically looking for our torches, but in our panic, we can't find them. And when the banshee screams for a third time, Kathleen decides she can't afford to wait any longer. She gets up, and in complete darkness climbs down the little ladder, opens the Wendy house door, and runs off to fetch us rescue. While Kathleen was gone, me and my little sister managed to find one of the torches, so we flick it on and point it down at the Wendy house door from the loft. I don't know what the logic was about that, but that's what we did, and then we cuddled together, cried, and waited for the banshee to get us. After a minute or so, we hear rustling outside the Wendy house. Something was moving outside. We're so scared of the thing hearing us that we've got our hands over our mouths. Well, we still can't stop crying, and we still don't turn the torch off. Suddenly the door opens, and what stepped inside made me and my little sister scream in pure horror. Blood was pouring down the mouth and chin of my big sister, and now she's back in the light, and now she too can see that she's bleeding. She smears a bit of blood on her fingers, looks at it, then promptly collapses. We are absolutely inconsolable at this point. Me and my little sister are begging, screaming, crying for our parents to come and save us. To us, Kathleen just ran out to get help, and the bloody banshee's only gone and gotten her before she could make it. We're trapped, and the banshee's getting closer. We're doomed. Then there's more footsteps outside the Wendy house. Heavier footsteps now. Banshee footsteps. The door swings open again, only this time the face that appears is our dad, wanting to know what's going on here. We're screaming, "Dad, there's a banshee, be careful, it's got Kathleen behind you, Dad." He's obviously skeptical at anything at first, but when he sees Kathleen's face, it's his turn to be terrified. He turns ashen, grabs Kathleen's little body up in his arms, and then rushes back to the house with her. So keep in mind that even at this, the point of parental intervention, Dad has not taken the time to tell us that there definitely isn't a banshee. And if anything, his reaction at Kathleen's face confirmed that. Not only is there definitely a banshee outside, but he's completely abandoned us. Seriously, just try and imagine being 7 years old and that being your truth. We didn't calm down for hours. Mom and Dad said we were still up crying at 1 o'clock in the morning with the whole incident going on at about 10. Even when we knew everything was okay, we just cried because it's been so bloody traumatic. Obviously, there was no banshee, and we didn't find this out until years later for obvious reasons, but what we'd heard was the sound of foxes making love. As me and my sisters know all too well, when they do that, the lady fox screeches at the top of her lungs, producing what is a rather unsettling and otherworldly sound. Kathleen, being the brave big sister she was, had ran out to protect us. But maybe if she was as nimble as she was courageous, she wouldn't have run directly into that tree in her blind panic, almost knocking herself out in the process. Best she could do was then retrace her poor befuddled steps back to the Wendy house and pass out at the sight of her own blood. It's a story we tell every Christmas now, especially whenever there's a new boyfriend or husband making an appearance, and it always gets a giggle from those that hear it. But I think if you put a gun to my head and asked me for the scariest moment in my life, I'd say the banshee was when I was 7. I'm deadly serious. Scarier than childbirth, scarier than finding the lump in my breast, scarier than confronting my first husband about his drinking. Because I believe something I didn't understand was coming to get me. Something mythical, something supernatural, something that even Dad was scared of. Needless to say, there were no more sleepovers in the Wendy house that summer, and the whole thing went arseways and fell down a few years later. But me and my sister will always have that story to make us laugh, even though at the time, we were scared for our lives. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.